Hello and welcome everyone. We begin with our last panel for tonight, Storytelling Ukrainian Identity, Fiction, Non-Fiction Documentary. And to be honest, that's the panel I've been waiting for the most, and I envy you so much because I've been hoping to moderate it. But you're the one having the luck. And grill them. Storytelling and narratives are something that I deeply believe are a weapon and a shield, and everything depends from how you use them. And now Ukraine is in the position to become a subject telling their own narratives, and finally the world is open to hear them. So please welcome our panelists and the moderator, Stefan Ingvarsson.
I'm very glad to have this privilege, and I'm very glad that you're here with us. It's Friday night. We have a bit of a bar setting here, and I hope that this can feel a bit like the topics will not be light entirely, but I hope this can feel a bit like a relaxed conversation. It's been a long day. Some of us have listened to 2 previous panels. We still have 1 day of UkraineVision ahead of us. But I'm very, very honored to Ostap. I was just going to
We need you.
I'm very honored to sit next to Ostap Slyvynsky, poet, an essayist, a very active member and also vice chairperson of PEN Ukraine. And we will have a bit of a separate conversation in the very beginning because I would like to introduce him a bit and his writing. And then Olha Mukha, who you already know if you listened to the previous panel, and also Yuliya Yurchuk, who many know in this room and who have also been on stage before. But we will focus not so much on what they have been speaking about previously, but about a very specific project, a very specific project of 3 books. And if we talk about storytelling as a potential shield, or if we talk about the power of narratives and counter-narratives, or including new voices, new stories, this is at the center of this project and these 3 books. And it's also a very specific task as a writer where you're creating documentary fiction, or you're using documentary material in shaping it into something that looks like a story or a short story, but sometimes it's actually an essay. But we'll return to this, and I ask Olha and Yuliya to be a bit patient, and I will get back to you very soon. And then, of course, I have questions to all of them, and I will include you as well. So if you're accepting this timeline and this agenda, let's go. Ostap, apart from being a poet, apart from being a translator from many languages, you've also written your PhD thesis about silence in Bulgarian literature, which I just leave you with right now, because we will not venture into this. But if you talk to Ostap later, I have a lot of questions regarding the silence in Bulgarian language. But we will focus on something entirely different. We will talk about the Ukrainian language, which is something that you're very sensitive to as a poet, naturally. But you've also compiled a book that you called, or in English was called, A Ukrainian Dictionary of War, when it was translated into English. And we will talk about the translation bit a bit later, but I would just like to go straight into this topic. I know that also Serhii Shadan's Antenna that was translated into Swedish is something that some people in the audience might have read. It's also about what happened when the war started in 2014. What happened with the language, what happened with the culture. I mean, he as a poet also tries to register all these subtle changes that war brings about. But your dictionary is even, I mean, your dictionary is really focusing, is really trying to identify and define words where meaning has shifted or that have become something different or just gotten new layers of meaning. If we go straight into the subject, how did this idea start with you? And where did you start thinking and registering these differences?
Yes, the Ukrainian Dictionary of War is the most unexpected of my books, and I wish it never happened to me. I wish I wrote something different, a poetry book, some book of essays, whatever. But this book was necessary in some sense because it helped me come back to the words, to writing as a process, because I kind of completely lost my ability to describe reality when the full-scale Russian invasion started. And I was in this.
I mean, if we stay there, why?
Because I found myself in a reality which I could not imagine. It was completely unimaginable. I lacked words for it, and I remained in this state state of mind for maybe several days, and after that I understood that this reality, the reality of war, the reality of a big human disaster, because I spent these first months of war in my city where I live, in Lviv, which turned into a big humanitarian hub for hundreds of thousands of people, internally displaced persons. And the city hosted hundreds of thousands of people who were, first of all, they were confused. They did not have any. Most of them did not have any ideas, any plans, any further destinations. They didn't know what to do, and it was a very, from certain point of view, the fact that so many different people came to the city was helpful, because they brought their words, they brought their narratives, and I understood that war is not silent, despite the fact that it overcomes the normal human ability to speak, to describe reality, because it's a war. Reality is an overwhelming reality, but it brings some narratives, and those people came with their stories, and in the situation when I could not find my own words, I understood that I had to listen to what people were telling about, and it was maybe the only solution for me.
But there is a bit of a paradox here, because I mean, a lot of people would have focused, I mean, on the topic of our panel is storytelling, on the actual narrative, but you sort of paused and concentrated on the word. I mean, how did this happen?
This concentration, the idea of the dictionary came later. It was not the starting point. The starting point was very simple and very intuitive. I understood that I had to remember the stories that I had heard from the people. I could not record them, for example. I could not take any notes because I was not a journalist. I was not a reporter. I was a volunteer who helped, who provided people with food, drinks, information. We had a lot of very practical tasks those days. And this narrative was like, this listening was a parallel process. And I did not prepare it, and I did not have any system. I did not try. I did not even have an idea how to structurize the material that I had in my mind. I was coming back home after the whole day of this volunteering, of this very practical work. And I was taking notes. I was just writing down what I had heard from sometimes dozens of people during the day. And that is how I accumulated several dozens of stories. What kind of stories? Fragments of longer narratives, because these fragments were exactly what I remembered. And that's how this book, that's why it consists of short fragments.
Yes.
Sometimes they are very short, 3 lines. And this is partly a very intentional selective process. When and this is the answer to your question about the words, when I understood that the person uses some word in an unusual way, because the word is used in circumstances of war or the circumstances of exile. Sometimes this fragment was exactly what I remembered from the longer story. And I remembered it because it was special in some sense. It was extraordinary. For example, the person suddenly told something very personal or very unusual, or the person told something in a very metaphorical way. This is also one of my discoveries, was that the people, even those people who had absolutely no literary reading experience, sometimes they didn't read many books in their life, but in these exceptional circumstances, trying to express very special experience, they started speaking metaphorically. This is the question about the nature of poetry and the nature of literature.
And I think this is a fascinating aspect of what you were just describing as a disruption of normality, and something which is in its essence absurd to us, as war is. And I mean, it's very concrete, but it's also a total disruption of what we call normality. And I've heard these stories also being told by political prisoners who are not poets, but start writing poetry because there's no other way to express this very drastic and strange change of your normality. But I've also read somewhere in an interview that you started seeing that other people made poetic references on Facebook, or because I think there was a bit of a struggle, at least that's how I saw it from the outside, when the full-scale invasion started, that some poets went completely silent, some writers went completely silent and felt that language is impossible right now. I should just work with volunteer work or with the front line itself. But others started the exact opposite. And which is something that I am extremely grateful for, because one of the experiences I had of the war was these very condensed images that, for example, Artur Dron's poetry written from the front line, something very, very condensed that reaches us. We have we will never be on the front line in Ukraine, but there's a certain ability here which I have never really reflected upon, in a sort of transmission of empathy, even if you're not transmitting the experience. But then I have a question regarding language, because, of course, when we receive this, often in translation, we're not feeling these subtle changes, which is exactly what you were focusing on. Because, our language is the same. We speak the same. When this translation reaches us, how can we? This is why I'm so interested in how you would describe this, because of course for us the Ukrainian language has not changed. We do not feel these changes. I think you can only feel them when you're inside.
Well, I don't think so, because it's not merely a semantic question. It cannot be measured linguistically sometimes. Sometimes it's the appearance of some images in a very unusual circumstances, focusing on some details, for example. That what was striking for me was the fact that many people telling their describing their very extreme experience, they were focusing on details, very usual details. For example, there is a story about cannery. It was when we were. I was talking to a lady who escaped from the occupation in Irpin. It was a very extreme, the most extreme day in her life, probably. It is challenging to talk with people about such extreme experience, because it's a real art which I discovered. I did not have any psychological education or training or whatever, so I had to reach many things intuitively. But one of the things that I understood very quickly was the fact that you should not focus all attention on the traumatic experience. You have to
move around it,
to move around it, and to focus the conversation on the person as a whole, and to underline the value of what the person had lived through before the most traumatic experience. Otherwise, the people feel like experimental object, and it was it can be very insulting, very offensive sometimes even. And when I was talking to that with this lady about this hardest day of her life, he was focusing all the time around this cannery, as if the cannery was some kind of key to what really happened.
It was her bird.
It was not her bird.
No.
This is the matter of fact that it was not her bird. It was the bird who was left in someone else's apartment, which was almost unreachable at that time, because the entrance to the building was destroyed, so no one could enter it, and the people escaping left the bird for some reason. They left the bird inside, and the lady was hearing the voice of this bird singing inside the apartment, and this was the most striking. I think this is an element which becomes a universal metaphor, and that's why I think these short stories, the way they do their job to tell the stories of our war in the most universal way as they can, because they open it to very universal things. You don't need to know much about the reasons, the context, the history of Russian aggression against Ukraine, but reading these very simple stories, simple but psychologically and emotionally powerful stories, you start examining why could it happen, why these people had to live through such horrible things, and many people who were coming to the presentations of different translations of the Dictionary of War. If I'm correct, as for now, there are 8 or 9 translations, already 9 translations, and almost everywhere. The people after the presentations, they were approaching me and saying that they started reading, they started getting more and more involved in Russian aggression against Ukraine after reading these stories. They were the first step.
Mm-hmm. Let's get concrete. Could you give us an example? Everyone who's listening here of one such story, one such person.
It's very hard to choose, but okay, one of my I can't say favorite because it's not favorite. It's not about being favorite, but one of the stories that really moved me much. It was one of those stories which were told by soldiers. I did not. The fact is that
soldiers on the leave. I mean,
on the leave.
Exactly,
because
I temporary leave. Yeah.
I did not work. I didn't work at the front line or in the frontline regions at that time. This is my idea. My next idea is to go, because I have to complete this. Because I'm feeling this as a gap, that we don't have many frontline stories, many stories from the soldiers. So this was a soldier on a leave. I met him in Lviv when he was. I met him in a hospital, military hospital. The story is called Chok. Valery, Kyiv. One day in the Kyiv region, we dropped by a school that served as a base for the Russians. We found a lot of stuff, including their documents and abandoned belongings. They had written all kinds of crap on the blackboards. And then we went down to the semi-basement, where there were some technical facilities. That's where they had kept abducted hostages. Maybe they interrogated them down there too. I sense the spirit of these places. It's impossible to stay there as if there's a hand that's pushing you out. And then, on a wall of some of those rooms, I saw written in chalk, "Help, Katya." Just that. And there was a piece of chalk in the corner. It might have been the same piece used to write those words. I took the chalk with me, as if that piece could help me find Katya. If she's still alive, of course. I kept picturing it like that in my head. Are you Katya? Oh, is this your piece of chalk? I found it at school. Let me help you. Funny, isn't it? And when Valery told me this story, after his question, funny, isn't it? We laughed. I don't know why. This is later when I read this already written fragment, I finally understood the real meaning of the whole story. But when we were talking, it seemed even funny to us in some, because it's an absurd situation. And I posted it on my Facebook page. And I hoped that maybe Katya would read it, if she's alive, of course. But unfortunately, none Katya responded. And we still believe that Katya that she is somewhere, and maybe one day we'll meet her. But unlike Katya, there were the other people mentioned in the stories who were coming to the presentations of the book. And I was really happy to see them alive. For example, a guy who is mentioned in the story about teeth. A guy who was interrogated and tortured in captivity, and then he escaped, and he lived for some time in the temporary shelter without teeth. And I did not meet him personally, because his story was told by my friend, who was a volunteer at this shelter, and she described him as a big schoolboy, because he didn't have teeth like a kid, and he was sleeping on a little children's bed. But the only difference, she said, was that her teeth would never grow again. And after the presentation in Lviv, a very handsome young man approached me, and he said that he was very surprised to read his story. And he smiled, and he had all teeth.
Well, it's a good thing that, even though your teeth do not grow, we can replace them.
Yeah.
Ostap, we will return to you in a second. I would like to turn to Olha and Yuliya. You've been introduced before. You're a historian, philosopher. Olha has a very interesting project, if you didn't listen to her yesterday, Unseen Force, which collects stories of resistance under Russian occupation in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. All kinds of resistance. But we'll leave that for now. Let's talk about the project Stories from Ukraine.
And we actually can't leave it for now, because one of the stories is literally dedicated to Mavka, one of the movement heroines, and it's called Mavka, a story about mythical being in a digital world that orcs are scared of. And when I was preparing the exhibition and just gathering documentation project, I found out that the diaries from occupation, they were the most touching materials and that people felt for. And I think that I work with sensitive material for ages as being part of Territory of Terror. So obviously we kind of have no choice. That's professional focus. But the main challenge in those terms is how to tell the story no one want to hear about. This is the biggest problem and biggest challenge because it's all traumatic. It's a lot of drama involved. And I found out that storytelling can be quite a tool where people being hooked with what's going to happen next. And then you develop in the story. But for me, the main challenge in this, and actually that was one story, and the second one was Veronica.
Sorry.
Sure.
I'd just like to focus out a little bit and just tell everyone, what is this project? And it's divided into 3 books. Let's start there. And then I want to dive into the stories that you have worked on. But if we just look at the whole project, it's called Believers, Keepers, and Fighters. 3 different. So please introduce these 3 volumes to us.
I'm in Believers, so I will start.
Yes,
Believers are the youngest group, those which have those hopes and beliefs, and those basically both of stories they under 25. This is those which are not literally joining the front line, but sometimes they do. And then the second you are, I believe, in
the fighters, and then
then we both in keepers.
Yes.
Fighters, this is this middle-age group, let's say 25, 30, 50 or above, and then 60 plus, those are keepers, those who preserve the cultural heritage.
Maybe we should start with the keepers, because chronologically, this is older Ukrainian history.
It's all the Ukrainian history, and what is also specific to this project is that all the stories are written by Ukrainians about Ukrainians who are still alive.
Yes.
God.
So let's also specify the process. So all of these stories have been told to someone who has given it a form.
Yeah, and actually the publisher, Victoria Narizhna, she had this idea with her team to really match the author and the person. So when Victoria wrote to me, she said, and I'm not a writer, I'm a historian, but she said, I have a perfect match for you, and I want you to write this story. And I was first surprised, why me? Because I am not a writer, and actually I really tried my best not to write about the actual problems, because all my career I was working on very hard topics like memory, Bandera, etc. And I always was promising myself I won't touch upon everything very, very touchy. and then Victoria explained this idea, and I thought I can try, but for me it was a challenge, because Victoria's idea was like you meet with your interviewee, the woman, and we want you to tell the story of 2 Ukrainians meeting in Sweden under these circumstances. And you coming from different backgrounds, and you both came to Sweden because of different reasons.
And you meet here outside of Kulturhuset.
Yeah, and everything helped just everything happened just here, and we met literally near the entrance. And why this woman was special? Because she is coming from Gammal Svensk by, the old Swedish village in Kherson region in Ukraine. This is a very small town, and why it's called the old Swedish village? Because in the end of 18th century, there were settlers who came from old Swedish territory. Actually, it was the islands which are now in Estonia.
Yes.
But these are Swedish people, right? And Swedish-speaking people. They came with their language, they came with their traditions, they came with their belief, their religion. So everything was there. And Victoria's idea was that we meet here and maybe we will kind of find some common ground both in Sweden and this very old Swedish history and in Ukrainian history. But what I discovered was much deeper. Larissa was not from this old Swedish generation. She was of old, as she said, Cossack family, very much Ukrainian. And then this process began, and maybe later I can come back to this because it was very difficult for me, and it was exactly because of this going around some trauma, and I had no idea about Larissa's story, what happened to her really. And we were speaking about her life for like 2 hours, and then
the editor who did the matching, she knew.
She didn't know the whole story.
No. Okay.
No. And then finally, after several hours of discussion, this story came, and I was not prepared to that, and it's really kind of difficult for me because I didn't expect what will be coming, and then I also felt a huge responsibility how to tell this story. So we met just before the midsummer. It was June, and then I was thinking about what she told me for several months, and I wrote the story in at the end of August. I was able to really bring it on paper, and then it was done, and I sent it back to Larissa, and she called me up. I was so afraid, and she called me up and she said, "Yuliya, you did such a great job. You should continue writing." And I was like, yeah.
Do you want to tell us something of Larissa's story?
Yeah. I think that I won't tell like all the details, but I will tell the most important things because Larissa came as a refugee here. She was very reluctant to come to like anywhere. She wanted to stay, but her sons were already abroad, and they kept on asking her to leave Ukraine. And as you know, it was the region which was very close to occupation, and then it was occupied, and then it was
liberated.
Yes. And she told everything about this occupation. And what she said that it was actually sons who really made her leave. And so she left, she came to Sweden because one of the sons was here. And it was not the first time she was in Sweden, because before she's such an active woman. She's just full of energy. She's very beautiful, and she's just, I don't know, she's just energizer, really. And when she came here, like everything was happening like to her. She found her job. And everything was very like good for her here. But it was not first time when she came, because she came first many years ago, actually as a teacher. And she was such an interested person that she learned herself Swedish. And she then started teaching Swedish to Ukrainian children in Gammalsvenskby. And she brought these children to Sweden to play football. And she said when she was kind of trying to get students, she was promising them, if you learn Swedish, we will go to Sweden. And then she did everything possible to make it happen. So she was already here, and she was fascinated with everything Swedish, like really. And for me, it was also a challenge to kind of don't project my own feelings about Ukraine or about Sweden on her. So, and I wanted to show like my own attitude to Sweden and Ukraine and her own views on Sweden and Ukraine. And this is like how I framed the whole story, that our stories are not the same, and they sometimes overlap, sometimes not. And then she, as I said, stayed here. Then she went to Ukraine after about a year. Then she met with her husband in Odessa. As she said, she had a week of the best time in her life. She came back, and her husband was killed. And this is something what came at the end. And. Yeah. But the whole story was actually about her love to life. And this love, and she is very, very warm woman. And I didn't want to make this story into one specific tragedy, because it is tragedy, but I wanted to make it about her choices in life, how she wanted from a very little town know the world, and she learned the languages. She went to work to Lithuania, and she learned the Lithuanian language. She is a person who inspired me so much that I really my challenge was how to give her voice this strength and this power she has. And it's not only about the war and about this specific experience.
And Olha, precisely on this topic of finding the form, I mean, you work with different narratives. This is what you do to a large extent. But I mean, this project has a very specific idea.
Yeah.
To match. To match a storyteller, a listener, and then a person who will find the shape, who will find the form.
That was actually the main requirement, that you need to have this personal connection. This need to be this internal chemistry with you and the hero of your story. And for me, that was very interesting challenge still, because I used to work with narratives, and as a researcher, as an academic, when I have very harsh methodology, how you write it down, how you work with it, how you quote it, all those little details, or as a part of a pen movement, when you also build a case on that, right? So you need to be very precise with every single detail and a fact. And here, when we started to work with Kovala Publishing, I told Victoria, but I didn't know how actually to allow myself this freedom. And she told me, look, you're such a storyteller. Just tell, like how you were talking to your students. So for me, I started with not really writing it down, because I'm very demanding on how it's written down, but recording the story, how I'm telling about things. And then afterwards, writing it down. And I found out that this is such an amazing tool, especially when you are given this wild, and Victoria asked me, how you are telling those stories, this picturing cinematographer way. And I was like, well, that's just this wild imagination. She said, let it go. This is how you speak to people. You want them also to create this picture inside, and this is what brings the emotional connection. And as we build this emotional connection, and I think that probably the most important part of it, and I do know that it's gonna echo what Ostap was doing and what you, Yuliya, was doing. This is building this trust. This is when you are allowing person to open up. This is a very particular moment. Sometimes it happens after a couple of hours and hours communication, when they finally feel they can be themselves, but they are not quoted it literally, so they also feel this other kind, another layer of freedom.
But let's also go into the specifics. One of the specific stories that you're telling in the book, because I mean, since it's not translated to Swedish, I would like it to resonate in this room, because storytelling, let's not be just theoretical. Let's tell the stories as well here.
I'll read you just the beginning of one of the story, Veronica, a story about the stage, a forest, and a coffee shop.
Yes.
A young woman, along with a group of soldiers, makes her way through a dense, leafy forest. Hearing a burst of machine gun fire, she falls into the mud with the others. It's wet, cold, uncomfortable, and incredibly hard. A miserable rain, instead of pouring down from above, seems to just hang in the air, which allows it to sneak under your clothes through sleeves and trousers, legs, before hiding under your armpits and creeping into your lymph nodes. It smells like the sea. The young woman, Veronica, desperately wants to cry. You can't guess where and who Veronica is. And this is a beautiful story of a future actress. I still believe she's going to become. She's one of the Ukrainian refugees, and she tells her story how she finds herself after. And she is one of the Ukrainian minorities, by the way. And she finds herself with her mother in Moldova first. And then it's a very funny, short way from Moldavian, little, quite poor town to very posh area in London, in Kensington, and how she starts finding her way there. And then, she started to work in a coffee shop, and all of a sudden, she's in this forest. How come? How this quantum leap happened? And this is exactly how the war events mixed up all our lives. She was trying to find how to respond to this internal guilt that she's not doing enough. Her father is on the war since 2014. Her older brother is also in a war. They are all from Gagauz family, and they are also somehow keepers. They preserve this cultural heritage. And then she decided that she wants to go to the training camp to become an interpreter for the Ukrainian soldiers trained there in the UK. This is how she found herself in this forest. And this is a very beautiful story of her self-reflection. She's very young. She's very young, beautiful, bright, self-doubting all the time if I'm doing the proper thing. But she's such an energy nut that it feels like everything is working around her the very same, very familiar way. Now she's back in Ukraine. She is, during her interpretation work, she learned such a lot that she became factually trainer. She passed the exam, and she now can serve and help the army forces, and also she initiated all big volunteer initiatives. And she said, next time I'm in London, well, I'm finally an actress. I'm gonna act. So it's still in her plan, but this is this big life pose, which not actually a pose, which is gathering all and embracing all this incredible and never expected experience. And I think that this is the beauty of all those stories we're gathering, that you actually can never guess what's going to happen next. And I think sometimes that in creative fiction, that would be treated as a bit fishy, a bit artificial. But here we have this beautiful excuse. Those are real stories.
Yes.
This is how life looks.
And I mean, let's hope that life allows her to think about something else than responsibility and pursue her other dreams. But I was thinking precisely about this. I mean, you are looking for a form. You're not fictionalizing. It's true stories. It's recollections, actually. But when I mean, everyone who knows that, also a journalist, usually, you use the tools of fiction narratives to create a story. You decide where the story starts and ends. You decide what to highlight, what to cut. Did you have a responsibility in this? I mean, how did you feel your responsibility in this, finding the form for it?
For me, even more challenging was with the other story about Mukha, actually, because here is a huge responsibility. Here you need to fictionalize things, because even little detail can release their identity, and this is life danger for them, right? And I remember when we were hesitating if I can describe her, and that was very funny moment, because at the very beginning, she was always using this, you know, this funny fake voice people use for reals. Yeah. And you talking, but very serious things, and it speaks like that, and you try not to laugh. And obviously that was a bit challenging. And there was one time after a couple of months of very short but still intensive conversations, when she just released her hood, like she asked me, "You're not recording, right?" I was like, "No," and she just taken off her hood, and I still feel embarrassed. And I'm like, "Oh wow, you literally Mukha," and she was like, "You are literally a Russian soldier. You thought I'm whom, like special agent, a tomboy, who am I supposed to be?" Like, she's like, "This is why it works, because this." Russian patriarchy, they do not recognize us, beautiful girls, women, as a power, as a threat. And this is what helps us to be hidden. And for me, there was a big challenge how I should describe her. I was changing her color of her eyes, color of her hair, and everything like that. Just getting back to this again and again.
Because this was my precise question. I mean, if you try to anonymize, you do not want to change. I mean, the capital of the story is that it's real.
And I found out that the core sense of that story, that was my impression. There was this unexpected beauty. That was it. But all the other elements, like there are also the diaries from occupation, so you need to change age, obviously names. The only thing which we agreed to stick to, it's a region. That's the same. All the other, and for example, how easy it's to put people in danger, let's say in Yellow Ribbon, one of the core activists, the core active group, was built on football fans. And this is very easy to recognize football fans in every single little town. And you need to describe, but also to hide. And this is quite a challenge, and I think that fictionary tools, when you stick to past the emotion, past the affect, helping here a lot.
I mean, it meant a lot for me to read the story because, I mean, in my line of work as an analyst, I've written 2 policy reports on the occupied territories. And I also, I mean, I had access to direct sources through our Ukrainian partners. I was given anonymized sources built on trust that I could speak to. I never saw any faces because we spoke through secure channels only. But to hear real stories from the occupied territories, because this is something we're not seeing. I mean, and I think it affects the perception of the war and perception of the so-called peace that is now on the table. Because for me, I mean, if we look at the war in our reporting, it's the front line, it's the shelling. The shelling into Ukraine and the front line. But because we do not have international organizations present in the occupied parts of Ukraine, because we do not have independent journalists there, we do not have the stories, we do not have the images. And so we're not really seeing the consequences of, what is discussed as, Ukraine must realize, have a realistic approach to these territories. They are now under Russian occupation. It's unrealistic to imagine a liberation of these. But the violence there, it's something, it's ongoing. And if we focus specifically on this, because I will zoom out again, but if we focus specifically on the occupied territories, that you have done, not only in the story but with your work. I mean, what can we do here? Because I think this is the most untold in terms of.
And it's very challenging as well.
Yeah.
I had plenty of fights around this topic, also in with Ukrainian journalists as well. Like we do not see them. Everyone who loved Ukraine already left. The people sometimes do not understand the challenges to getting out.
There's a stereotype that all our collaborators.
Absolutely, and this is one of the biggest problems. But just to understand that to get out, you need to pass through at least 16 to 22 checkpoints. Each of one can be your last place. Then you realize, and especially if you were at least a bit visible activist, pro-Ukrainian, as we know about stories in Crimea and others, you absolutely can't do that. You need to sit quiet until it's of any possibility. And in those terms, I mean that telling the story, probably the best feedback was once when we were holding the exhibition in Kyiv, in Ukrainian house. There was a very challenging group of Polish journalists which came to Kyiv in the middle of the affair of agriculture problem with the farmers. They were a group of quite challenging people, not necessarily writing in a nice way about Ukraine. And through stories, those diaries from occupation, when we told that if you haven't accepted Russian passport, you have no medical support. Those are real stories. If you haven't got the passport on exchanged, you're losing your property because you need to re-register.
Let's specify this. So the passportization policy is that anyone who basically wants any services.
Whatever it is.
Register something, go to school, get medical help, needs to become Russian.
Like literally from the last week, you can't top up your mobile phone if you are not getting the details of your Russian passport.
And I do not have the estimates, but also, I mean, the stereotype that all our collaborators, at least in December, when I last checked, there were almost 1 million people. That is, if we estimate that 2.5 million people live on something like this, live under Russian occupation, so at least 40% have resisted passportization. So they are living in some sort of limbo, some sort of vacuum where they cannot get actually medical assistance.
Nothing, like nothing.
But as a sort of fact on the ground, they are resisting. They do not want to change their citizenship.
But the thing is that people do not understand the challenge until you not run them through the story. And at the very end of that tour, one of those journalists told me, you know what, I think that something switched here. Because from that distance, you see the war, you see injustice, you see numbers, statistics, and you're kind of getting used to this. But through those personal people stories, I've seen my kids, I've seen my grandmother, I've seen my mother. I've seen that this is what can happen to each of us. And I think this is the main power of storytelling, because you can embrace it as a part of your own possible development of life.
And I can't help putting one more fact on the table, and that's from the 1st of January, according to Russian law, the people who have not switched their citizenship are now considered foreigners.
Yeah, the foreign agents.
And they have not only lost access to medical care or basic services, they are now also considered foreigners on their own land, and they are subjected to deportation, and they can have their property confiscated. So I think just to realize what we're talking about when we're saying Ukraine needs to be realistic and understand that this is now controlled by Russia.
Regarding the storytelling and how storytelling helps understand better what is happening in these muted territories, because I started perceiving these territories of Ukraine, which is around 20% of Ukrainian territory, as a muted territories absolutely drowned in silence. which is horrible because we don't have we don't have a normal informational exchange with these territories. But recently there was a very interesting interview with a journalist, Ukrainian journalist, who managed to escape from the occupied territory, and she told several stories of the people who decided to return to the occupied territories, because those people are usually blamed in Ukraine. The public opinion blames them for some kind of betrayal. How can you do it? How can you betray your country? You betray your nation if you decide to go there. But it's a completely groundbreaking interview because it reveals a real stories. This is exactly a power of human story. For example, she told a story of a young woman who escaped the occupied territories at in the very beginning of Russian aggression, but she did not manage to convince her father to leave his home, so he stayed there. And after that, after several months, she got the information that her father was starving. He due to the whole stressful situation. He was partly paralyzed, so he could not feed himself. He was starving, and she had no other choice. She had to go back. She had to take this risk and to take care of his father, her father. And this is one of many stories. This journalist told around dozen stories of this kind, of the real reasons of those people who decide to to go back.
And of course, there are hundreds of thousands of reasons.
Also, the context.
Very personal, very different.
Very important thing is to understand the context. And you just reminded me very, very interesting and just quite sane story from Lviv iteration, when volunteers called me like, here is a Russian-speaking granny. She seems to be very angry. She's slumming something in Russian, and she's spitting on the posters on the exhibition, which is precisely Mariupol, St. Mary. What should we do? What is your first thought? Pro-Russian, right, spitting on religious symbols, posters. And they asked, they were quite scared, should we call the, I don't know, security? I was like, no, leave her alone. If you have a chance, give her a cup of tea. I'm going to be there. I came in 40 minutes. She was still very angry, shaking, and sitting there already with that tea. And I started to speak her in Russian. And it appeared that she's from Mariupol, and she had the only grandson who was killed in Azovstal. And she was kind of packed to the car and moved to Lviv. She never wanted. She wanted to stay with her grandson at her grounds. And this is, it switches the whole thing upside down, right? The context explains a lot. And I think that this is our responsibility as a storyteller, to tell this umbrella, to give this umbrella view, the helicopter view, which allows the readers or listeners to understand it deeper.
I want to have a contract with you because we started 8 minutes late, that I will prolong this session 8 minutes, just if you all agree. Ostap, I wanted to ask you a question because their situation was very specific. They were matched by the editor of this book with a person. You told us the story about the teeth, where the story was given to you. So you were transferred the story through another person, and you told it. what did you feel in terms? I mean, what type of response? Because you were an observer, you were a listener. You did, as I understand, not always have. You were not always open with the intention to write something down or record something. You were picking up things. I mean, it's not disclosing anything personal or that someone can identify, but I just feel that, you know, it's a slightly different situation. Could you describe how you felt when you were looking for the form, for the working with it as a poet and you know, as a writer?
The form was challenging, but the most challenging thing for me was my identity. Who am I in this whole process? And here on the cover, I'm the compiler, compiled by. This is not completely correct because
you have translated Hanna Krall, I think. I mean,
yeah.
When she. Yeah, there's some similarities.
Yes,
there
are some similarities, but again, this is not the same situation.
No.
It's something. There is something. My role is something in the middle, because I'm not just the compiler, and this is not the anthology. Because even in some reviews, the book is called the anthology. This is not the anthology, because I did not compile the texts which were ready, which were made by someone else, and I just compiled them in one book. But my role was different because I helped some narratives to be born. I was kind of I was there when, and my role was to help those people tell these stories. But this is only a part of these stories. The other part, and I received these stories on the second stage of my work on the project after I started publishing the first stories on my Facebook page, and I did not know, I could not predict the reaction. I did not know whether I was not sure whether I was doing an appropriate, relevant thing, publishing these stories, because we were all very triggered at that time.
Yeah.
And it could be too re-traumatizing. But I took this risk, and I published some 3 or 4 first stories. And I was absolutely surprised because the reaction was very enthusiastic, and people started commenting, started sharing these stories. Moreover, many people started contacting me personally and proposing different roles, different. They wanted to play different roles in this project. Some of them wanted to translate them, and almost immediately the people started translating these stories in different languages. One of my friends decided to become a kind of PR manager of the project. It was his idea. It was Taras Malkovich, a son of our prominent poet and publisher. There were graphic designers, artists who wanted to make illustrations. And the picture here, the picture on the cover of this American edition is painted by Nastya Avramchuk, who contacted me. It was her initiative to get involved in the project. I met her. She personally was an internally displaced person. She lives in Irpin. Moreover, what was the most interesting for and most important for the project, that many people wanted to share their stories. and it completely changed the idea of the project. Because initially, my idea was that I talk with people, I listen to their stories, I remember them, then I write them down, and I compile it this way. But in this specific moment, I understood that it can't be, it won't go that simple, because I could not refuse from these stories. I could not tell people, no, thank you, this is my project. And it turned into a kind of not literary project, but a social project. And I started including, of course, selecting, because I started receiving stories written in a very different style. Sometimes they were too literal. Sometimes they were too artistic. I mean,
Because this project is about reduction.
The stories they are very concise. They are very simple in terms of style. But of course, I have many contacts in the literary spheres, and many writers started sending me their stories, and sometimes they were too artistic, and they did not fit to the project. And I was looking for polite formulas, how to say, I'm sorry, but your story is beautiful, but it does not correspond with the idea of the project. And I have several dozens of stories I did not use. And they are still in my archive, and I will use them one day.
I think that this is actually a great illustration to this, and I think that's very important what you and all of us started this, creating this language of war, because previously we never had this luxury to reflect and create proper language. For me, this is also very personal, because my mom and my grandmother, they never spoke, because my mom, of her father, she was seen as Russian. She wasn't, but she was Moscow, who was out this typical Western Ukraine story. And when my grandma was very old, my mom was the only one who was taking care of her. They never spoken until her dad, until her died on my mom's arms, because they had no this language. They have no words.
I want to give our listeners a chance to ask 2 questions. So
Sure.
I will pause here, because there's a whole second chapter that we could have about how you collect the stories for Ukrainians in a Ukrainian context, and of course what happens with them in translation and when they reach us.
True.
But I leave this topic because of the time span we have, and I open up for questions.
Yuliya was there.
My question is, how do you see, what patterns do you see in the change of Ukrainian literature or storytelling from before and after the occupation of Crimea, and then after the full-scale invasion? How does the patterns of Ukrainian stories appears? If you could.
I can maybe start, because when Ostap was speaking in the very beginning, I thought about the poem of Luba Yakimchuk, and for me, when she speaks about the language which disintegrates, and I think this is also translated into Swedish, and for me, specifically, this is a very symbolic first poem which is associated for me with the war, and with what happens with the language. And about the literature, I would say that mainly, of course, we have all genres. They are all developing and flourishing, actually. But we have also a lot of this kind of docu-fiction, and a lot of also literature written by soldiers, veteran literature, which will be also discussed here. So, yeah.
I will, if I can add something, it's to your observation. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is poetry, and documentary nonfiction. But we still have problem with big fiction, big prose works.
It takes time.
It needs time. It needs time, and I even partly agree with the opinion of Halina Kruk, our fellow poet, one of the most prominent Ukrainian poets, writing about war as well. She said that it's very probable that the best, the most influential novels about Russian war against Ukraine will be written not by Ukrainians, but the people of other nations, because they have this comfort to be outside, to sit at their desk in their room, to concentrate, to build the structure, the architecture of the novel, while being in the eye of the cyclone, within this war hurricane. It does not give a chance to start systematic work, which is necessary for writing a big fiction work.
I just want to add it as a reader, and I want to use this chance to thank you and Hala, because when I have no words to cry and to shout, I'm reaching to a poetry. I'm going to your guys' Facebook pages, and this is my way to cry it out when you have your own words. And I think this is one of the healing secret of blooming Ukrainian poetry right now.
I just wanted to say something. I interviewed Yuri Andruchovich in Lviv in 2014, and I asked him what will the war do with Ukrainian literature, and he said it will do bad things because we have to be really black and white now. We are on the barricade, and there's no time for subtleties. And he was wrong. And I can say, after reading Ukrainian literature for a decade, he was wrong. But this was his first reaction when the war started.
Questions?
Thank you so much for this insightful panel. This last comment actually ties into my question nicely. I do have a question concerning language and literature. A considerable number of people in Ukraine have switched to the Ukrainian language, including Russophone or ex-Russophone Ukrainian poets and writers. Which is remarkable, of course, because to a poet and a writer, language is really their primary prism and tool in the world. Now, perhaps also weapon. So my question is a Russophone Ukrainian literature possible today?
Oh,
Дякую.
big question.
I have an answer because in one of the stories, in our stories, there is Iya Kiva who wrote her own story from her own experience, and she is a poet from Donetsk, and she writes specifically in this story how she couldn't anymore write in Russian. And then I also remember Sasha Dovzhik, whose also mother tongue is Russian, and I remember in the first days of invasion her essay when she writes that she would like to cut out her tongue because it's betraying her. And so I think that for many this is this shared feeling, which I can see at the examples I observe. Maybe we cannot see something, but what we see, this is what Iya and Sasha.
It's still possible. Last year, Encounter, Ukrainian Jewish Award, one of the absolutely great novel which made it to the short list, was written in Russian, and it was absolutely recognized as a part of it. I think that this internal deflection, and for me, I kind of deliberately forgot Russian in 2014, but years before for me was a way easier to write down the philosophical article in Russian because all of the textbooks were in Russian. All the translations of a big philosopher were in Russian. But I think that's also a process, and I think that it's nothing more valuable for us than to listen when someone speaks very kind of cute and bad Ukrainian, and you understand that this person just switched it into Ukrainian. And this is such an emotional response internally. You evaluate all those efforts, and you understand that sometimes for those people, it's years of their historical background, their family, the lullabies they were listening to, and this is how they are making this effort just to understand, because the war, yeah, it is like ours and yours, this is it. So this division obviously happened.
Ostap?
There are very different scenarios in these relations with Russian language. It started more or less in 2014. And I will give 3 examples. The example of Volodymyr Rafeenko, he used to be rather successful writer who wrote only in Russian. He lived in Donetsk. He was awarded several Russian awards, and I'm pretty sure that he considered himself as a part of Russian literature, not Ukrainian, despite the fact that he lived physically in Ukraine. He wrote an absolutely exceptional novel. It's called Mondegreen. Mondegreen. It means the formula which is heard in the different way, in a false way. That the phonetic form of the phrase makes a false semantic impression. It's from the, it's from the old, it's from the old English ballad, and laid him on the green. And if you mishear it, you can think that it's about some lady Mondegreen. It's a Mondegreen. Mondegreen is about it's a novel about the trauma that you mentioned, this writer's trauma of change, of language change. What happens in the writer's mind when he changes the language of his writing, and it's kind of psychoanalytical text, self-analysis of what happens. The second example is a poet, Stefan. He made the same way. But for example, there are writers who did not switch to Ukrainian. Khersonsky's case is very special because he made this step in Ukraine in the direction to Ukrainian literature, and he had a very specific period in his life when he wrote in Ukrainian, but then he came back to Russian. It's very interesting. He did not feel comfortable in this language, or it was a reaction of some rejection. I'm not sure whether it was a mutual rejection, or it did not work in his case. But there is also a third very interesting example of Anastasia Afanasieva, a very extremely interesting poet from Kharkiv who wrote in Russian. And in 2022, she wrote a poem. I don't remember the name of the poem. It's about it's kind of silencing. Sorry? Yes, a new song of silence. which is a kind of farewell with his previous writing, and now she's keeping silence. She does not. I don't know whether she writes something, but she does not publish anything.
Or like Ilarion Pavlyuk, he writes in Russian and
translates,
and then publishes only in Ukrainian translation.
I feel this is a good this is a good spot to end, because as you understand, we could continue. And we have opened a new chapter, which is the question of language. I really want to thank you. Yes? Yeah, I know that I was going to say that. Yes.
Yeah. Canary.
The little canary is here, and I also want to say that this was my final remark, that Ostap is translated to Swedish and was translated already when this magazine was called Tiotal for the first time.
Here is the bird, and
but there are also
the short story about it. Maybe you can read it.
We really need to wrap up, I think. But
there's original illustration, by the way.
This is the illustrations that were in the book. Yeah. I wanted to thank I wanted to say that Ostap you can read in Swedish, not much, but a little bit, thanks to 10-tal and then 20-tal, with different translators. We hope to read, yes, among others, and I really would like, I hope that we can read more in Swedish. I'm also very glad that we could present this book project, and this whole and the next step would be, of course, to find ways of transferring these stories further and also into Sweden. Thank you for staying with us on a Friday night. I hope it was worth it.
Thank you.
Thank you.